Welcome to the Embryo Adoption Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Mellinger. On this show, we explore the possibilities embryo adoption offers to families often struggling with infertility, though not always. Through insightful interviews and moving stories, we uncover the blessings of this unique path to parenthood. This podcast is brought to you by the National Embryo Donation Center, giving hope to those longing to grow their families. Now, let's get started. Well, what a joy to have Hannah Strege, the first embryo adoption baby, with us on this edition of the Embryo Adoption Podcast. And, Hannah, even though you weren't technically an NEDC baby because there was no NEDC when you were born, you may not have been the first embryo from a donor, that was to come to birth. You are widely recognized as the first embryo adoption baby, the first from a semi-formal adoption, quote unquote, process. So it's a big deal to have you here. How did your parents explain to you that you were an embryo adoption baby? The whole thing was so new when you were born back in 1998.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. My parents were very creative. So my mom froze 20 seeds and we put them in the freezer. So we counted out 20 and each seed represented an embryo in me and my siblings. And then she kind of showed me like just how each of these seeds aren't going to grow from being frozen. Not every embryo is going to survive the freeze, the thaw, and the transfer to be like plotted in soil. So we did the whole shebang. We froze the seeds and then we planted them and watered them and just kind of like imitating what it's like to have a pregnancy for a little girl to understand. So I would tell people I was adopted as a seed and put into my mommy's tummy to grow. And that's how I would explain it to people for years.
It's a great way, I think, to envision it.
Yeah.
So this sort of helped you understand, the circumstances of your birth. When did you really get that it was a big deal, that your birth was atypical from most other kids?
Yeah, I think it really just fell upon me taking all those trips to Washington, D.C. and meeting the president and having a lot of experiences normal 5 to 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds don't normally have. To know that, oh, you mean not every kid goes to the White House or meets the president? And like, I didn't really get that, but I did realize that this was a big deal even back then. And so I've had a lot of opportunities open to me just to kind of spread the word about embryo adoption, just kind of fall in my lap when it comes to embryonic stem cell research and couples reaching out to me. People will reach out to me with my personal, Instagram or social media and are like, hey, we want to adopt frozen embryos. You're the first, like, tell me what to do. And so it just kind of fell into that natural, like, this is what my purpose is.
And I want to talk about your advocacy work, more so what you're doing now a little bit later on in the podcast. But let's stay in those early years. Your advocacy started along with your parents because of your unique story, very young. Are there 2 or 3 sort of most memorable experiences from all that? I mean, you were on Focus on the Family a lot. You mentioned that you were at the White House with President Bush to do a snowflake advocacy event, a snowflake baby advocacy event. What really stands out to you?
Probably standing behind President Bush for his first veto, celebrating Snowflake's birthdays in the great rooms in the White House, and I don't know, singing on Dr. Dobson's lap, because he's my godfather. So when I was just, I think, about 2 years old, singing Jesus Loves Little Children on his lap, and that really opened up a lot of doors for other babies to be born too and adopted. I think those are probably the most memorable for me.
Tell me about your relationship with Dr. Dobson.
He's a very special person. I actually just got to see him here, I think last month at the gathering here at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs, and we got lunch with him, I think a couple weeks before that. Um, and so it's just really special throughout the years for him to support me and support my grad school and college journey. And um, he's always been very supportive of embryo adoption.
Is there anything that he's ever told you specifically about embryo adoption? That's what I'm looking for, but it could be anything that gives the rest of us some insight into his heart for you, for the unborn, for life.
I think just knowing that these children are not spare parts and that they are not just frozen in time, these are people. And so he really humanizes and says, like, this is a crisis that we have on our hands, that all of these babies are frozen in time. And a lot of couples may not be planning to go back for them. And so he just sees this as really a rescue mission for us to really care for the unborn.
And that's what it is. It is a rescue mission. And it was one thing that I really did support about President, or really did like about President Bush. He's the only president we have had who
Yeah.
has really decided to advocate for this issue in any sort of forceful public way. Any
Mm.
moment or two that you remember from your interactions with him being at the White House? I think just about anybody would have interest in that. All of us would think, gosh, what would it be like to actually meet the president and shake his hand when you, especially when you're there because you're united on an issue that you're both passionate about.
Yeah. I mean, just taking a picture with him, I remember the photo op because we've had the photo displayed in our house for a long time, and as one should. But he called me a pioneer, and I think that that might have been the best term for it, of like starting this movement of lots of other babies being born, adopted, and um found forever families.
Interesting. You definitely are a pioneer, and it makes me wonder, Hannah, how do you feel? And I've asked this of other embryo adoption children, so I'll ask you, how do you feel about your genetic family, about the 18 genetic siblings that you had who didn't make it? They didn't survive the thaw.
Yeah. So it's 19 actually, 19
Oh, it was
siblings.
19. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's okay. And I don't know, I hadn't really given it much thought. I've been very open with my story throughout the years. But it wasn't until we saw Heaven is for Real. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. But the main character, Colton, dies and he goes to heaven, and he meets one of his siblings that was miscarried. I think before or after he was born. And his mom's asking him about meeting her or him, and she's like, well, did she have a name? Because it ended up being a little girl. And he was like, no, you didn't name her. And so that was very eye-opening to me and my family when we saw the movie, of like, these embryos don't have names. Like, they're not often even recognized as people. So why would we name them, you know? And so my parents and I decided to name each of the 19 that didn't survive, which was a long process because I was really excited to do all the first names. And um, but this was years ago, and I wanted to do middle names too. And but anyways, we didn't get that far. But I had framed one year for my mom like a collage of all their names that we have displayed in our house, just to kind of honor them. Um, and since like there were more girls born in my genetic family and my family, we had more girls than boys, but it was a pretty even split. But it was just a really great way. We prayed over the names, and we were really excited to give them memory in that way.
And that's one thing I love about the way that you do advocacy. And this is a belief that the NEDC shares. We believe that these embryos, from the moment of conception, are
Mhm.
God's tiniest image bearers,
Yeah.
fully human
Yeah.
and worthy of protection, sanctity,
and dignity. And I know you share our view on that. Do you have
Mhm.
any relationship? Have you had any connection with your genetic family? I don't think I've ever delved into that.
Yeah, I have five genetic siblings, and um, we're all really at different stages in life, but I met them when I was eight. Well, I met them as an adult when I was 18, but I had met them before that growing up. And it's just been a really fun time to establish a relationship with them as adults, because we're all varying ages in our 20s. And so um, we went to Disneyland, I think shortly after I graduated high school. And then I have them all on social media. I went to one of their weddings. One of them stayed at our house a couple times. So it's just fun to have that open door and to know like where you come from, but also just to know that your family is not defined by your genetics or your blood, and that's the whole part of adoption too. If like these people are my origins, but they're not necessarily my family. And so kind of learning how to separate the two, I think can be really hard for a lot of people. Um, but I think it's really important to be like, yeah, these are great people and I love that they're in my life and that I have that door open. But my mom and dad are my family. They're my parents, and they adopted me. And so making sure those roles are really clear is really important too.
So it's a special relationship with those brothers and sisters, and I'm again now talking about the ones who were born before you know your parents had a chance to adopt you. It's a special relationship. It's not
Hmm.
family though. That's an important distinction, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think now that I'm kind of in a role, a social work role where that's kind of coming up more and more, it's just really important for me to help people define those familial boundaries and setting those because, once that baby is born, that adopted embryo is born, those are the legal guardians, those are the legal family. You relinquish those rights as mommy and daddy when you place your embryos for adoption too. And so you're going to relinquish the right to the term brother, sister, grandma, grandpa, all of those things when an embryo is placed for adoption, just like in a typical adoption. And I think that's often forgotten just because it's a different type.
Do you have a connection to the people who were involved in the creation of you as an embryo?
You mean my biological parents?
Yeah, so that would be a better way of saying it.
Yeah. Um, I don't really. My biological mom passed away about 15 years ago, so I didn't really get to know her. And then my biological father, I got to go to Disneyland with him. So,
Well, this is so good hearing your honest accounting of your journey. Well, before we get to what you're doing now, I wanted to hit this. You did submit an amicus brief
yeah.
urging the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade in the lead up to what would become the Dobbs decision that ultimately did overturn Roe v. Wade, which of course we celebrate. How did
Yeah.
all that come about? That's got to be sort of cool to play at least a little role in history there.
I think that embryo adoption is really the answer to this pro-choice, pro-abortion conflict that we have in the United States, just because my biological mom and my adopted mom did not add anything to make me who I am today, My mom provided nutrients, a warm place to grow, oxygen, and love, and nothing else. So I was self-sustained as an embryo. And so I think that that's really the answer to this debate that we have going on in our country that embryo adoption is the answer to these are human lives. And I think that it would have been a missed opportunity to not participate in the amicus brief. And you really never know what really caught the judge's eye because they all had to read my amicus brief actually at some point, which was really cool. So they all had to be very aware of embryo adoption. So it's on their minds now. But it was just something that I've been called to do to share my story and to be a spokesperson for these embryos that don't have anybody to speak for them.
And I was going to ask you that question. I was going to ask, do you think that this being an embryo adoption advocate is God's call on your life. And obviously it is one of his callings on your life because
Yeah.
you just said that. So I'm sure that's part of it. But it also would have been possible that you're the first embryo adoption baby and you decide, well, I don't want to advocate for this. Why do you think obviously God's called you to it, but let's unpack that a little bit. Why do you think you have become such a big advocate for embryo adoption?
Yeah, I think it really goes back to a prayer my mom prayed, back in the day of just like, Lord, please give me the child that would want to pursue this. Please give me somebody that would place that on their heart. And so it really just seems like I would be missing what God has in store for my life. And, it was a lot to kind of get to this point of being born in the first place, right? And so God obviously had a hand in, oh yeah, we want that one. We want her to um continue on this journey and really support other families and support life and advocate for that. And so I feel like I would be missing what God has for me if I didn't pursue that.
Well said. Unpack the changes you would like to see in the way that embryo adoption is practiced.
Yeah, I think that the
Often,
adopt
I should say often practiced, because different places do it differently with different motivation.
yeah, not creating more embryos than a family can parent, I think is number one. Not freezing children because freezing kills lives. Um, I think just some more regulations on the industry in general. I think that um, we should limit donor egg and donor sperm, just because when it comes to an adoptee, you don't really know who you're related to because sometimes those donors can be closed to the public. And so you don't know if they'll potentially be dating siblings, or maybe they don't have any medical history or records. It can become really difficult for an adoptee not to have that. Um, I also think just redefining terms, I think that the adoption part is key because adoption humanizes an embryo and it humanizes the process. And like once you go through a home study, I think that really just shows like, yes, these parents are ready and have a safe environment to bring a baby home to. Um, and also the adoption part just really helps define terminology. I think I touched on that a little bit of biological family, donor, genetic family, who your siblings are, who mom and dad is. I think it doesn't leave as much room for interpretation. Um, so I think that using adoption forward language and having the adoption regulations put in place of having a home study and things are important.
How do you think you or anybody can practically make a difference in this world of big fertility, where the fertility industry, by and large, is so unethical? I mean, it produces some good
Yeah.
results. We thank God for those for the inability to have children that a lot of couples wrestle with, that fertility doctors are able to fix. We recognize the good that it does. There are a lot of problems too, and there are also powerful interests allied with continuing to push things in the problematic direction. How do you think people who share your concerns can practically make a difference?
I think advocating for embryo adoption is really important because if you hear a friend or a family member is struggling with infertility, I think to say, have you ever considered embryo adoption? I think a lot of people don't even know about that option either. Um, I think regulations, just advocating for those in the industry as a whole, is also really important. Doing your own research and these doctors are practicing under their own ethics in some ways because there are no regulations. So they're practicing under their own morals and standards. And I think that can be really scary. And I think that often when it comes to technology and what science can do, I like to think that, like, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should be doing it. Just because we have the capacity to do it doesn't mean it's ethical and we should be doing it either. And so I think that's where we're kind of coming to in our science, and kind of where we're going with our technology, to just really be mindful of, what are we doing here? Is this in the best interest of the child? I think that should be the number one question families and doctors and the communities asking themselves is this in the best interest, or is this fulfilling a selfish desire? I think that's a really hard question to wrestle with.
I hope we can get to that paradigm where we're putting the interest of children first. Children who are here, and children who will be here as a result of that technology that the fertility industry uses. So tell me what you're out of college now. You'll be 27 by the time this podcast is posted. Explain like what you're doing professionally, what your passion in life is, and where you see your life going right now at 27. It'll take a bunch of twists and turns that you're not expecting. We know that. But right now, where do you see it going?
Yeah, right now I am a licensed social worker in the state of Colorado. So I have my LSW, and I graduated with my master's in social work from Baylor. And right now I'm working on getting my LCSW, which is a licensed clinical social work license, and to start my own practice. So I really want to do adoption counseling. Right now I'm working as a full-time therapist, just in generalist practice. But I really want to get into something more niche, because I think that adoption counseling is not something that's really out there, especially for families, adoptees, and then extended family and biological and placing families. It's just not something that's really there, something long-term. And so I'm really wanting to do that and kind of open up a big umbrella of things. So there's a lot on the horizon of things I want to do.
Why do you think God led your heart, and maybe you don't know, that's okay, you don't have to answer if you don't, toward being a therapist? And I ask this as the father of somebody who will also receive her master's degree in just a few months, to be a therapist, to do exactly what you're doing.
Sure.
It sort of scares me. Maybe it's the home that she grew up in that led her to want to figure out people's various pathologies or help them through that. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think for you?
I think I really just needed to pursue a degree where I could help people. So if I could go get the education and get the knowledge base of how I can support individuals and hold space for people that are going through tough times, or really just having a difficulty processing what they're going through, I think professionally, I've been able to do that for years on end, of just people messaging me and saying, hey, Hannah, I need advice on this, or I need consult, or just about embryo adoption or adoption in general. And so now I'm actually doing it for a career where I get paid for it. But that's not why I'm getting called to do it. I just think that going to school and actually getting the skill set on how to do it, I think was really important in what I wanted to do.
Hannah Strege has been my guest. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us here on the Embryo Adoption Podcast. Thank you for the work you have been doing for so long to advocate in an ethical way for this cause. And I know that in the decades to come, the Lord will just continue to use your life to help others in exactly the way you mentioned. And it'll be interesting to see where this topic of embryo adoption is, say, 30 years from now. But wherever it is, I have a feeling you'll be playing a role in it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Embryo Adoption Podcast. I hope you enjoyed learning more about this life-changing option for building a family. Hey, if you or someone you know could benefit from embryo adoption or donation, visit embryodonation.org to get started or just to find out more. Again, that's embryodonation.org. And don't forget to spread the word, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Join me next time as we continue sharing inspirational stories of the embryo adoption journey. And until then, take care.